So I've been commissioned by the RSU to speak on I've put it as the history of the People's Revolution in Nepal, since that's what after 1990, they engage in an event that they call Jana Andolan, which is known as the People's Movement. So, you know, obviously they're communists, but the name of this is People's Revolution in Nepal. Just a quick preamble. There's a context to all history, and on my point of view, I should be clear as to my methodology. This history is not complete in most senses of the word. This is not to say that it's been purposely included, but in fact we need to include things as a matter of pragmatics. Thus, we choose and make these choices that we do, whether we know it or not, to determine how history is judged and ipso facto our instrumentality of it. I will not tell the history of Nepal that buries us with details of every occurrence so that we drown in an ocean of facts, which most are irrelevant or distracting. In writing this presentation, I can't help but think of Nietzsche's contemplation of history in his essay on the advantage and disadvantage of history for life. We need to engage in a particular type of history. The type of history forthcoming aims not to be monumental recollection of heroic events, nor a history whose end is presented as an already foregone conclusion that mummifies the living in the name of the past. Rather, we need to engage in a critical history. There we go. As such, I've chosen the valorous struggles of the downtrodden peoples of Nepal. This isn't to say that I've taken entries out of the illiterate peasants' journals. History will be presented as it comes from reports of newspapers, reports of humanitarian organizations, and other officials' places of notary. I will present them chronologically as faithfully as possible, giving exposition to contextualize and connect the relevance of these events. By these, I think we can augur the diverse peoples of Nepal's struggles. We will see that history is taken from these sources show a history of class struggle. When I use the word people, it should be immediately apparent that it is a somewhat ambiguous choice. It is not the entirety of the Nepali people that suffer from history's progress. Of course, you'll see standard binaries, kings and subjects, men and women, rich versus poor, in short, haves versus have-nots. But we also observe things that appear uncommon to us, like people repressed in the hierarchy of a Hindu caste, like the struggles of the untouchables known as the Dalits, as well as others. As we traverse the Nepalese people struggle, we could easily identify three major stages. The first is the formation of the Kingdom of Nepal to the overthrow of the Rana line, the second being the kingly reinstatement of the modern advancements until the last stage, which should probably be delineated as the start of Jana Andolan, or the People's Movement. So I'm going to try to go a little bit faster through the parts before Jana Andolan, just for the sake of speeding up. So in 1768, Prithvi Narayan Shah of the Gorkha dynasty forms three kingdoms that officially becomes what is vaguely recognizable as Nepal. You may be familiar with the word Gorkha because Gorkha soldiers are something that persists through our culture, at least ethnically, even though they are from Nepal, as sort of fierce soldiers and things like this. They come from this kingdom. They came from sort of a warrior leader caste, which is not unlike the connections to its Hindu caste system. 1815, Nepal goes to battle with the British India East Company and fought over the small bordering provinces on the Nepal-Indian border, specifically in the Talrai region. There we go. There we go. They fought very fiercely. This is where Gorkhas got their, sort of reputation. The British East Indian Company underestimated their warcraft and basically got their butt kicked, and then they came back and strong and more powerful forces and also had guns and things like this, and eventually won. And they lost the Talrai region. This is known as the Gorga Shah line, and in 1846, the ruling class of royal and military fight amongst themselves for power over the country, resulting in the Kop massacre, which amounts to a slaughter of a lot of royal family and other royally appointed figures. As one may or may not imagine, in India and Southeast Asia, there's, especially among royal lines, tons of wives and tons of kids, and there's lots of infighting. But then in addition to that, the Hindu caste system has royalty, military class, religious leaders like Brahmins and things like this, and there's all sorts of infighting that goes on as a result of this. And I think even if you look at the CIA World Book, I think Nepal is actually officially put as a Hindu nation. And if it isn't now, it was forever. I mean, it was officially the only Hindu nation. I mean, that even includes India. So Hinduism has its extreme influences, and of course, it's infighting. As a result of this, the Gorga royal line was sacked and was replaced with the military. Young Bahadur Rana, who made the king relegated leader, and replaced him with a new de facto king post called Prime Minister, which is a powerful and hereditary position in the Rana line. It starts the Rana lineage. The Rana dynasty was a pro-British monarchy, and helped in the repression of Indian rebellions, and were awarded the Talrai region in 1857, which they lost in the battle to them previously. Skip ahead a little bit here. The British Empire in 1923, after World War I, and their help in World War I, awards them their own sort of statehood, pretty much because the British Empire didn't find it necessary for them to not be officially autonomous, so that they can just get what they want from them anyway. It's also about this time, in 1923, in 1924, slavery is abolished as a progressive reform. 91 years later, it's formally banned throughout most of the British Empire. I don't know the conditions behind this. I get the impression that the pressures that amount behind this were sort of liberal reforms that were going on after World War I. Of course, you have the formation of the League of Nations, and that all the empires are being, pressured to release their empires, and they don't want to do this and things like this, and so, they give Nepal their formal clearance, and then they're like, oh, maybe you should roll back slavery, which is something we should have done with you 91 years ago, but here it is anyway. Things don't really improve for the people living underneath of the Rana line. They're a highly militaristic sort of class, and in addition to that, they're not particularly nice or do any sort of power sharing or are interested in the world reforms. So, I'm even a little surprised to see this in 1924. As early as 1930, dissident groups were forming. There was a group called the Praja Parishad, who gained support from the formal king of the Gorga dynasty that has been relegated. His name at this time was King Trubhavan, in the overthrow of Rana rule. So the idea was that, the king would enact all these liberal reforms and things like this that everybody's getting very excited about. Here we can briefly glimpse into the tension struggles occurring between the Shah line of kings and the Rana monarchical ministership. August 15th, 1947 marks the date of legal statehood in the Republic of India as an entity away from the British Empire. There we go. At the particular time, fervor for progressive politics was catching on like wildfire. Many political activists from monarchical Nepal were in exile in India, fearing political upheaval and especially the formation of a new republic. The then Prime Minister Mohan Rana had essentially banned the formation of political parties and criminalized political activity. In addition to that, about this time, he's actually sent off the titular king, the figurehead king. He's also been banned because he's organizing, he's running around with the project of power shot, and they just weren't having any of it. And then they made the formal official king, a 3-year-old or something like this, because he chased off the royal family. Political parties were essentially banned by the Rana dynasty at the time, and during this time we have the formation of 2 major players. The first of these is the Nepali Congress, which formed in 1947, and later on we have the Communist Party of Nepal forms in exile in Calcutta under the leadership of General Secretary Pushpalala Srivastava. 2 years later, we have a major incident of revolt that ended up overthrowing the Rana dynasty. So I'll just quickly go over that. The Project Parasad formed a coalition with the Communist Party of Nepal under the designation of the People's Democratic United Front in July of 1951, and had unified pressure against the Rana, who were at the time working with the Nepali Congress, maintaining their stronghold over the Nepali people. The Rana dynasty was essentially really worried that these guys were going to be successful, and so they were kind of working with Nepali Congress to enact, these stopgap liberal reforms, and that they failed. So, between the years 1950 and 51, under the banner of the liberation, King Trubhavan led an unarmed insurrection of loyalists, liberals, and communists, and forced their way into political viability. Like most harsh dictatorships, a lot of martyrs were made, and remnants of their sacrifices still observed this day in Nepal. You have, basically, it's a minimal program that these martyrs are celebrated underneath them. It's just like we're overthrowing the Rana dynasty, we're going to have a holiday about it, and that's the way they treat it. The crown is restored. In February 1951, King Trubhavan Shah returns from Indian exile, and in November that same year has pressured the Prime Minister Mohan Rana to resign. No longer the Ranas will maintain the prime ministership. In 1952, in 1952 we have the Rashtra Dal Mutiny, leading to the banning of communist parties. Of course, surprise, the king wasn't very interested in liberal reforms either. He just was interested in getting back in power. And so those people that actually wanted to get really progressive, push some equality on, Nepal, was, the Communist Party, and also we have other parties like the Project Parasad. Basically, they were cast out of Eden, and I guess it was there to fill in the gaps of the government as organized underneath the king, none other than the Nepali Congress, who we will continue to see very supportive of whoever is in power, just as long as they get a piece of the pie as well. So what happened is the communists became outcast. They basically started organizing in the countryside and started to engage in these sort of liberation things where they try to make autonomous regions, and then they sent in the military and killed them all, and that's just their history. Once again, we'll see that repeated several times. After sacking the Rana powers over the ministership, the government they were governmentally unstable. There was a period of constitutions in which they tried to make 2 or 3 constitutions, and then apparently there was infighting between appointed parliamentary parties and between the king Trubhavan and his prince and his son Mahendra. I think the next one is his death. Yeah, Mahendra, son of Trubhavan, ascends the throne in 1955 because Trubhavan is really old, and he just dies of natural causes. Pretty much, that's the going story in Switzerland. Now, it's worth pointing out, too, that when you look at the history, the Nepali people actually really do like King Trubhavan and Mahendra, and then later on, Dipendra. These are a royal line, and they did enact some liberal reforms. But, I mean, in a certain sense, the way that maybe the British are enamored with their royalty and like to see lots of good in them, you know, this is the way that Nepal treats their king. So, like, whenever the king's like, but I'm the king, you know, everybody's like pretty cool with this. Which is worth pointing out. It's a people's history. They're very excited about it. They're always constantly trying to roll back, whatever it is. I'll tell you about that in a moment. I always keep on losing my place. Oh, sensing that a revolutionary potential was in hand, an already fragmentary Nepali communist factions fell into rank under the banner of Nepali Communist Party, which is different from the Communist Party of Nepal, or CPN, which are the groups around today. After the election in 1959, the banning of parties happened alongside the royal re-seizing power of 1961. King Mahendra issued a new constitution in 1959. There was actually the first democratic elections. The moderate Nepali Congress won a sizable majority and formed the new government under the appointed prime minister. After a year of infighting between the crown and the government, he dissolved that. 1959, Mahendra dissolves the government, in 62, and forms the Panchayat, or partyless system. Get behind here on that. Okay, so I should explain a little bit about the Panchayat system. The Panchayat system is a throwback to the Hindu caste system, where local councils are organized around towns where both aristocracy and religious castes make decisions for the town. The difference would be in Mahendra's Panchayat system is much of this privilege is of course maintained, but Panchayat translates to partyless, which actually means there's one party, it's the king's party, and if you're not with the king, he'll just have you arrested because then you're a faction with the program and we can't have parties. So yeah, automatically if you're not with the king, you're against the king and they have a place for you. This is where things, you know, start to get a little bit more exciting. Communist Party largely dispersed in the countryside in an effort to activate and radicalize the marginalized masses who were disenfranchised by the Panchayats. Their culmination of class struggle happens between 1963 and 1973, when they are directly responsible for the formation of committees for groups of students, women's teachers, and Dalits, and basically, instead of following some sort of Leninist strategy all under one hood, this just kind of completely proliferates, and there's all these egalitarian movements that move up. So, you know, maybe like trans-unionism and things like this as well. But also what might look familiar in terms of identity politics and what such. This comes to a head in 1973 when the military suppresses the Nepali communist groups. They have this Naxalite-style campaign of violence and terrorism, and they get put down, and the communists are basically shut down for a little while longer. Mahendra's throne was succeeded by his son Biendra in 1972. By the late 70s, the throne was feeling the pressure of democratic reforms, and in 1980, in 1980, the king held a referendum with two choices, either a multi-party parliament system or the continuation of the old Panchayat system with some liberal reforms. They won by a slim majority, and the king produced the moderate reforms. So, you know, what I was talking about, how people love the king, he makes lots of, you know, promises to them, and that's, you know, they get it. So he actually did make the sort of liberal reforms, but it wasn't enough for them. And the example of this would be in May of 1985, when Congress, the Panchayat system, right, the sort of supposedly partyless system, launches a civil disobedience campaign, and bombs start going off in Kathmandu in June 1985. And then here's the last part, Jana Andolan, which of course I said before stands for People's Movement. It started in 1990 And this would have to be the breaking point, theoretically, when revolution would have set to have started. It is at the time that 7 major communist parties formed the United Left Front and formed an alliance with Nepali Congress, because that was just what everybody did. The People's Movement created a constitution that the movement declared to be in effect in 1990 of November of 1990. The important thing about this is it in effect identifies the people as the source of political legitimacy. So they have a sort of constitutional assembly, the king's not involved, and they're like, this new constitution's in effect because the people are the sole sort of the source of legitimacy. And they pressured the crown to accept it in 91, and they have their first election on May, which is the first election they have in over 4 years. I'm doing a bad job with here with the slides. All right. Nepali Congress wins the elections, who were the Crown's choice for parliamentary leadership. The local people dispute the results, and combined with the fact of the National Communist Party People's Front winning 9 of the sort of like, I think it was almost 200 seats, the Nepali Congress gets really jealous and sends out the military and police to punish the people supporting the communist groups. Any more here. Feeling like Yanda on the Lawn wasn't revolutionary enough, 4 of the communist parties formed the CPN Unity Group, Unity Center. A history of revisionism and compromises had finally set in. In this first convention, the group leader would be elected was Dr. Bhadram Bhattarai, who is currently an active politician. He's number 2 in the Maoist group now. And their line was, quote, protracted armed struggle on the route to a new democratic solution, unquote. And that declaration put them an enemy with the government, and so they have to go underground. In 1992, more of the same strategy of the Nepali Congress has found the Nepali people in the grip of a crippling economic crisis as a result of the changes that the government implemented. The CPN Unity ganged up with other less violent or revisionist groups to form the Joint People's Agitation Committee to effect a general strike on April 6th. As well as other agitation programs. On April 5th, April 5th, the day before the general strike, the committee called for 30 minutes of lights out before Kathmandu. Violence breaks out in front of the hospital when activists try to enforce the lights out on the hospital. On the morning of the 6th, strikers and police engage in armed conflict, which breaks out in front of a police station, leaving 2 strikers dead. Mass rallies that are scheduled for that day in Kathmandu are waylaid by police forces, and as a result, a riot broke out. Nepal Communications building was set on fire. Nepal Telecommunications was, under King Mahendra, the only phone company, which you see a lot of, especially with the news and, where am I going to get my telephone lines? It was all there. The police opened fire to massacre 14 people, including innocents. The magnitude of the event is held in regards in a lot of the ways that Kent State Massacre has occurred here, and I can personally attest to the man guards surrounding the building even to this day, including the charring on the side of the building, which I think people leave there nostalgically. So, with all these sort of changes happening, people are trying to, I guess, identify with the Maoists and the communists that are happening, that are affecting this sort of area. But there's a more visible face of the Communist Party, one that didn't go underground as a result of the sort of Janda Alan movement in 1990. The more visible face of communism in Nepal is the CPN, Unified Marxist-Leninists, or UML. And they ride on the communist fervor, and it curries more favor with the more affluent city-goers and wins the election, and as the largest party in forms government. The UML promises reforms and distances themselves from the CPN United Center as unnecessary and excessive. Even though they didn't have the largest amount of seats in parliament, they still had a minority, the largest minority of seats, they still didn't have what they needed to push out the reforms that they had. Combined with the threat of communist revolution, the supposed Communist Party joined forces with the Nepali Congress to fight against the rising Unity Center group. In 1994, Bhattarai and Pushpal Kamal Dahal, also known as Prachanda, and I'll call him Prachanda throughout the rest of the presentation, which translates into fierce, started a split in the group ideologically and in theory and in practice, and became so divided in 1996 they simply renamed themselves to CPN Maoist. There was kind of a conflict over the name, and they just went with Maoist. In 1994, various factions of the Nepali Congress, Nepali Communist Party merged with the Communist Party of Nepal Maoists, whose chairman is now Prachanda. The people of Nepal who suffer from the status quo under Nepal's Congress government are now mostly demystified under the sort of promises of change, democracy, but also the media hasn't saturated their ideologies so much as to blind them from the real political and economic reforms that the Maoists were bringing to them. The Maoists, obviously being underground, were doing a lot of operations and building, basically nation building, outside in the countryside of Nepal. Even though Nepal is the size of Iowa, you basically have 3 cities where, they're very affluent. But, I mean, if you take the country as a whole, it's literally the poorest, or one of the 5 poorest countries in the world. So they started building hospitals and schools and whatnot, and basically the Nepali Congress propaganda couldn't get to them about the Maoists, and so they started gaining popularity there. So that starts basically the People's War. Initially, the People's Liberation Army materialized on the countryside from that population. These initial actions were to liberate and radicalize Royalist police headquarters and district headquarters. Until the constitutional mandate, under constitutional mandate, the People's Liberation Army could only be resisted by the Nepali police because the PLA was considered an insurgent group. Officially, it wasn't until the police resistance occurred and officially it was only the police that resisted until the People's Liberation attacked an army's barracks in 2002. And after a failed round of peace talks with the Maoists, the military was employed. So the official date is on February 13, 1996. The Maoists start the Nepalese War with the following 2 goals: overthrow the king, and to establish a People's Republic of Nepal under genuine socialist rule. Why it's considered the first day is because they had a sort of joint coordinated strike, which includes the attacking and the razing of a Coca-Cola factory just outside the outskirts of Kathmandu. The town that resides in is called Coca-Cola, even though it has a formal name. The razing of a foreign-owned liquor factory. The government-controlled agricultural development bank in Shingali was ransacked and razed. An investment capitalist homes was raided with a reported 1.3 million rupees in properties, and species were seized, and loan documents and liens were resolved, which is code language for burnt and no longer valid. 7 people were shot to death in that. And in addition to that, you have 4 regions on which police outposts and explosives were requisitioned. Looks like districts and police outposts and things like this. So little Capitol buildings and things like this. In January 2001, the Prime Minister oversees the creation of a special trained armed police unit solely for the purposes of putting out the insurgency or the Maoists. In June 1st, we have a sort of random weird event. The Crown Prince Dupendra kills most of the royal family in a shooting spree, including the king. The reasons of which, are still somewhat mysterious to this day, but most people commonly agree that had nothing to do with political motivation. Princes obviously resembled the sort of cliche Saudi Arabia prince who wants to drive around and sleep with, the women and things like this. And I know this is a cliche, so don't send people after me.
But the point is that it was taken that he wanted to marry somebody, but she wasn't a royal blood, and he got pissed and then started shooting people. It ended with a flowered suicide attempt on the part of the prince, who finally succumbed to death 3 days later. King Gyanendra is crowned the king to be the next in line after the king and prince, who was conveniently away, and he's considered conniving, like a sort of Rasputin, like disreputable character, and we'll see why it is that the Nepalese aren't impressed with him in a moment. From August to November, the Maoists agreed to the peace talks, but not seeing anything closer to their goals being realized, quit them. The quitting is punctuated by the ransacking of police and army depots in 42 districts, where the Loyalists suffers casualties of 9 to 1. 3 days later, during the Nepali Congress, the UML's government declares a nationwide emergency and deploys the Royal National Army, which I talked about earlier. Then we have all these democratic reforms. In May 22, King Gyanendra dissolves the parliament under the advice of the Prime Minister and orders new elections. The official reason given for dissolving the parliament is his opposition to the state of emergency, which is apparently how you restore democracy, is by keeping the parliament around. 19 days later, Belgian arms manufacturer FN Herstal delivers 5,500 M249 machine guns, with the Crown decision agreed upon by all the royally recognized parties. The Belgian Foreign Minister Louis Michel claims that the shipment is allowed on a country with pluralistic democracy. Not to be beaten, the U.S. Congress approves $12 million in funded train the Royal National Army and supplies them with 5,000 Colt M16 rifles, which are still used as the official rifle of the Royal National Army this very day. In May, peace talks degenerate and large-scale conflicts break out over the border of Pittsburgh. We're going to cut this down a little bit. October, King Gyanendra excuses the Prime Minister who recommended dissolving the Parliament and dissolves the rest of the government and cancels the execution elections for the next month. Several days later, the Crown installs a new Loyalist Prime Minister. In August 2003, the military resumes operations against the PLA, killing 39. This is after a peace talks agreement. Maoists then threatened to break the ceasefire unless the agreement includes allowing the Maoists and the new constituent assembly. So the Maoists want to participate in the government, and apparently what it means to have a peace agreement is to not let them participate at all, according to the Royalists. The day after, the Maoists inspire a day strike that occurs for 3 days, denouncing the Royal Nepali Army's attack on the Maoist cadre during peace talks. During the strike, Maoists end a ceasefire, proclaiming that there's no reason for them to engage in the peace talks. In 2004, the Royal National Army starts extrajudiciarily executing Maoist activists, which raises even the ire of Amnesty International, which usually never does for communists. April 2nd marks the second biggest rally since Janda Alan. The message is pro-democracy and anti-monarchy. What's significant about this particular event, when strikes are happening all the time, is not only is it the biggest, but it's actually happening in Kathmandu, which is largely controlled and very sympathetic to the Nepal Congress, UML, and the Crown, and this sort of thing. So we start to see some serious inroads being made with the city people. April 3rd, a dozen trucks are burned while waiting for gasoline for Indian suppliers. This would have to speak to the influence that India has on Nepal. On the 16th, here we go. Yes, on the 16th, Maoists start to bomb luxury bomb the luxury hotel Solti after the hotel refused to close under Maoist advisement. Basically, and I want to highlight this as well, so it doesn't seem completely one-sided, that the Maoists, if you were not going to play nice with them and go on strike with them when they wanted to, they were going to start bombing you, and they did. So, it was kind of like, all right, you're either with the democratic forces or you're with the king, and so there were bombs being set off. On September 10th, the bomb explodes in the U.S. Information Office in the Capitol. 3 days later, U.S. Peace Corps and other non-essential U.S. officials are evacuated. And on December 23rd, Maoist forces launched a blockade on the capital, and over 15,000 hold a rally suing for peace. On February 1st, 2005, the Crown dissolves the government again and bans all news reports. The army starts to arrest politicians, journalists, unionists, humanitarian workers, civil rights leaders, and cuts all telephone lines and internet connections. This would be because people aren't very amiable towards the Crown at this point, and he didn't want them talking to the rest of the world about that. September of 2005, Maoists declare 3 days of ceasefire with the intention of allowing the other political parties to join up with them. In November, some of them join up in a common front against the ejection of the king. We're just about finished here. Alright. Let's go to May 3rd. Alright. So on May 3rd, the Maoists agreed to a 3-month truce with the newly appointed Prime Minister, which is the king appointed Prime Minister. But even so, this new cabinet underneath the Prime Minister basically declares that the Maoists are no longer a terrorist group, which means they get to activate as a real political viable party. This starts the peace procedure, and on the 21st of November, peace talks with the 7 major parties finish. The king is unofficially outed. The king unofficially becomes a republic, and there is a 12-point peace agreement that allows for the voting of the Constituent Assembly to form a new constitution to be completed by March 5th, 2010, which is like less than a week and a half from now, and an integration of the People's Liberation Army with the Royal Nepali Army. April 10th, the election of the first CEA takes place. Yeah. The CEA takes place. The CPN Maoists win the majority, although not 50%. It's the most amount of seats. Much to the surprise of the rest of the world and political parties. Up until this time, people thought that the Maoists were completely doing their whole propaganda thing, and they were. Let's not say that they're not. But they didn't think they garnered as much influence, and people were just kind of going with the flow, and it was kind of like, oh, I hate the government because that's what everybody does, and things like this. So the UML thought that they were going to capture the cities, and that the peasants were illiterate and were not going to be able to vote, and then the Nepali Congress would claim out second place. Yeah, it turned out the Maoists won this, which is a big threat because basically all the rival political parties were thinking that the Maoists would be completely relegated by democratic elections. And they weren't, and that's when the rest of the world was like, holy crap, what's happening? Are these people communists? So that's what started there. And on May 28th, 2008, the king is officially deposed by the Constituent Assembly, and the Kingdom of Nepal is renamed to the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal. Now, I should point out here that they have quite they're quite interested in doing the whole democratic thing. This is different from, say, the Maoists or, the sort of Leninist movement where, they want to include people, but if they don't want to be included, screw off, right? And there's rules for the inclusion. These people are allowing, people like the Nepali Congress who supported the royal, the royal family forever to participate in politics. And in fact, they won number 2 in the elections of, that would be April 10th. And they were also really committed to peace. But unfortunately, some things happen in the future that sort of seems rather undemocratic. July 19th, Ram Yadav is elected the president by narrow margin. He's the Nepali Congress candidate. The Maoists were kind of working with the UML to get their president installed. The president is kind of like an empty stuffed shirt in their country for what the king used to be. And it's got seriously limited powers to that. The prime minister is the holder of the keys to the city, as it were. In August 15th, Pranchanda, he was the chairman of the CPN-M, becomes elected as the head of government as prime minister. On May 9, 2009, Pranchanda resigns when the president reinstates the general to the National Army after Panchanda dismisses him for holding up the integration of the People's Liberation to the National Armies, which was part of the whole peace agreement. The whole thing of, all right, we're going to stop attacking, we're going to do the democratic peace thing, was, okay, but this royalist army that was fighting us the entire time, even though they're just as poor and can't seem to be converted or anything like this, needed to be integrated as a part of that. The person was upholding it, Panchanda fired him. The president is legally constituted, is able to reinstate the person does. So even though it violates the peace treaty, the very conditions under which war stops, he's able to do this. And of course it's ratified by the courts, and that's when Panchanda resigns. So the rest of the people that weren't democratically elected majority form a new government. This is a parliamentary system. It's a little bit different from this, and I'll explain later. Since this time, the Maoists and other sympathetic peoples all over Nepal have been holding regular strikes and protests that prevent the sitting minority coalition parliament from convening. Sometimes tens of thousands of people show up. People show up daily, but sometimes you can get up to even tens of thousands on a regular basis and blockade the assembly hall, which is where the CA meets. Many of these protests have occurred without violence. November 23rd, the Maoists call a 3-day stop to the protest, allowing the Nepali Parliament to convene for 3 days. It's an emergency budget, this sort of thing. Basically, like we can feed government workers and things like this. October 9th, the Maoists meet with the Nepali Congress and the UML and demand that they restore civilian supremacy over military supremacy in the presidency, and want the resignation of the Prime Minister. 2 days in November 2009, 2 days after Panchanda announces a deal with the Nepali Congress, Kiorola, who's a somewhat notable, venerable figure who was basically Prime Minister when the king was around, but that still doesn't make anybody hate you in Nepal. Behind closed doors, they say that they have this sort of peace deal worked out. The deal being that Kiorola becomes the new president, and that they form a new government with obviously the duly elected majority, Panchanda being the Prime Minister. Sorry, I'm running out of breath here. The explanation is that Nepali Congress backed out of the deal because, they were going to lose too much in it. December 12, 2009, the CPN Maoists declared 2 more autonomous states. Prime Minister Nepal, his name is Nepal, but also he's the Prime Minister of Nepal. I know it's confusing, but it's the minority governments. They instruct the Maoists that further liberation of these states will cause political configuration and untimely writing of the Constitution, which of course is not written to this day, is not completed, I should say. So the big story here is that a big issue in Nepal is federalism, and these sort of states want more autonomous control, and it's because it's extremely racially mixed. There's something like, I don't know, like 23 or 47 ethnic groups are in, ×2 languages and this sort of thing. And so people want a little bit more control. Basically, the Maoists, as far as I'm concerned, are liberating these regions only to form them back up. But the reason is to restore civilian supremacy. These places did vote Maoists in, and basically they were like, okay, this is liberated, and they're taking big chunks out of Nepal, and the people that are the illegitimate government holders are very upset about that, and they're saying, stop, politics is going to stop. It's like, the Maoists are pretty much like, you already stopped politics. On the 18th, the Maoists complete liberation of the 13th autonomous state, claiming that it was in order better to uphold civilian supremacy. And my very last point, you don't need to plot now. December 20th is that the Maoists lead a general strike that cripples Nepal, giving the ultimatum that the government needs to set up a new national government by the 24th of January, which is now past us. 70 persons were arrested, and the use of tear gas and batons were used to prevent demonstrators from blocking Prime Minister Nepal entering into his own house after returning from the airport of a climate change conference, which apparently you can attend if your entire country is an emergency. And the addition to the police suppression of the people's protest, which the Maoists claim was a peaceful protest, this is doable at least a little ways, But 2 people in parliament, members, were rioting or protesting with them, were badly injured as well. So that's the current state of Nepal. Hold on. There we go. That's the current state of Nepal. Right now, things aren't moving too much in it, but something is going to be happening on the 10th of March, which is when the Constitution is supposed to be finished. And if the government's insolvent, essentially, because they're undemocratic, nobody knows what's going to happen. So, you know, I won't even pretend to do this, but of course I know that the Maoists have a lot of support here. So anyway, that is some of the people's resistances and struggles in Nepal. If you have any questions, I'm going to take them, and that's it for my presentation. How about it? Go ahead.
How does the Nepali program of the new democratic state under Bajwa and Bajwa, you said they were different from the traditional Leninists and the traditional Maoists. How does their policy program differ from Leninist program of national liberation and the Maoist program of new democracy?
Yeah, when I was making reference to this sort of non-Leninist thing, that was in the years between 63 and 73. And basically, the Communist Party in Nepal, when the wind blows, they all scatter into the wind, at least historically. Now, the Maoists have been collected, and the UML have basically this sort of slightly center-left, you know, sort of group. But then pretty much there's nobody between them now. But that doesn't mean that can't scatter at any moment. For instance, it's perfectly, at least historically, possible that in March 10th, there's going to be a split in the Maoists between the people that want to try to do things still the peaceful resistance strike way, and more of a sort of like, how should I say, direct democratic approach with weapons. So that may form another split, and that happens all the time. I mean, I mentioned it 2 or 3 times, how about, you know, 7 parties will form into one, and this is the sort of thing. And those, I think, are the properly Stalinist moments. But when they were scattered, after Mahendra essentially banned all political parties, and they just scattered, and they started egalitarian movements and small little things, and they just didn't have the organization then. And it was all quashed, you know, with the Japanti communists. Basically, they had an Naxalite terrorist campaign, and it was all that stuff. Go ahead.
I thought you also said that in the recent years they were not Leninist because with the autonomous regions.
Did I say that?
I believe I heard that.
We were talking about democracy.
Yeah, you said it was non-Leninist because...
You said like with the Leninists. And
yeah. Here's the thing about federalism in Nepal. Federalism on Nepal is basically done on sort of identity groups' rights. Like, for instance, the 2 regions that originally started off as autonomous regions were in the Talrai zone. And the reason why is they consider themselves very ethnically different from Nepal, because Nepal in some ways has a loose sort of, all right, we're Nepalis, right? The Talrai identify more with the Indians. Also, people like the Madhesis People's Liberation Front is another group that's like this. They advocate for federalism, but essentially what they want to do is maintain sort of Hindu elements that are unegalitarian. So when they liberate these zones, they are properly communist, and they are for the communist people, they are for the sort of, how do they put it, it's civilian supremacy. Right now, the state does not have civilian supremacy, and that's what the Maoists are for. So they're going to liberate those zones, and like I said, I think the idea is, of course, to liberate those zones until all the zones are liberated, and then conglomerate them together. So I don't think it's not Stalinist. I just think that some of the motivation behind federalism, at least originally, not by the Maoists, is the sort of identity politics. So we should be, you know, Hindu and speak Hindu if we want to, as opposed from Nepali and things like this. Yeah.
So when Lenin basically says that sometimes you have to liberate nations in order for them to return to an internationalist non-nation. Would you see this as happening in Nepal just with the replacement of nation with ethnic region?
Yeah, I don't think that the Maoists are selling them a bill of goods. I think that the people under the Panchayat systems and things like this, right, have really been oppressed. I mean, think about it. The People's Liberation Army consists of 60% men, 40% women. People who are considered untouchables, like the Dalits and things like this, actually employ, they have constituent assembly seats, something that was completely forbidden either by law or by de facto law, and things like this. So, you know, I think when those particular areas are federalized, I think it's done like in the sort of basically like divide and conquer approach. That's what I think. Go ahead.
Well, the reason why I bring this up, I mean, because well, let me ask you this: how do you see the Nepali Maoists in regard to the Revolutionary Internationalist movement?
You mean the RIM?
Yeah.
Well, I know that Baltarai is kind of the guy who's in charge of that. He's number 2 in the Maoist solutions, and I think they have pretty good relations to that.
Well, the reason why I ask is because several key RIM members, most notably the Communist Party of India and the Revolutionary Communist Party, have been incredibly critical of the Maoists for what they see as leading Marxist-Leninist Maoism, right? And so when you, however, and the Maoist supporters of Nepal do not see the Nepali Maoists as leading Marxist-Leninist Maoism. And so one of the key international criticisms and lack of international communist support is because they're accused of being revisionist. So I hope you can understand why.
Yeah.
Then the argument that, in fact, the Nepali Maoists fall within the tradition of Leninist national liberation and Maoist new democracy is not an argument that is without.
Right. I mean, basically, I guess their argument would be the Panchanda path is a veering path. It's an off-ramp for the proper Leninist Maoists, you know. Yes, and, you know, those people are scholarly experts, and so they might be able to tell me why I'm wrong, right? But my initial impressions is they are more Leninist than these other groups. I mean, it would seem to me that these key constituents, people from India and things like this, I mean, the Maoists don't really need help as far as I'm concerned in terms of, you know, having control. There are issues there, but the Naxalites don't need to come in and help them. But, you know, they should be supporting them, right? That's where I stand on the thing. And I do think that it's a properly Leninist strategy. I just think it's a, you know, the sort of national liberation, but on a smaller scale with states or areas. So that's my opinion on it. Anything else? Sorry, I hope it wasn't too boring for you guys. So I know it was for some of you, but some other people maybe not so much. All right, thanks. That's it.
Well, let's give him a hand. Thank you for your